I'm Caglar from Goodgame Studios. We are developing and publishing mobile games and web-based games. And yeah, we are here to talk about IP games, advantages and disadvantages. I mean, they are coming in the last 12 months, I would say. We see a lot of games, IP-based games, like from Marvel, from Disney, etc. And we have some people here having experience with IP-based games, and they are going to talk about their experiences and pros and cons of developing and publishing games based on IPs. So it would be great if you guys can introduce yourself and say a few words to your experiences with IPs or without. I mean, yeah, like David, Gamevil, they didn't do any IP games, so maybe he will talk about from another perspective. So, Rob?
Okay. Hi. I'm Robert Zakari. I'm Executive Vice President of Corporate Development and General Counsel for Jam City. We used to be SGN, and we rebranded last year. We have probably an equal mix of IP-based games and also games that are our own IP. And so we have a pretty good outlook on either one, and I'll share that with you, and I look forward to having a lively discussion with my fellow panelists.
Hi everyone, I'm Sebastian. I'm responsible for business development and partnerships at Wooga, a mobile game developer based here in Berlin. We are focusing on developing what we call casual games, so in the three genres of puzzle, hidden object, and casual simulation. We are most commonly known for our actually original IP-based games like Jelly Splash or Diamond Dash. However, we've been also working on a Futurama puzzle game that has been released in February last year.
Hello, my name is David. I run the European office for Gamevil. Gamevil is a Korean mobile games publisher. We have a sister company called Come to Us. We also do work for those guys. Our top games are Summoner's War, which we are trying to really push as its own brand and IP, and which is doing quite well. It's top grossing number 3 in Germany and France right now. Other than that, we have mostly in-house developed games and IPs that are not well known in the West, but we do have a lot of sports titles, and we are licensor, for example, for the Major League Baseball. So I guess that also falls under IP, if you will, because we are licensing something. So I have these two perspectives I can share.
Hi, I'm Simon. I'm the co-founder of IQ. IQ is a Holland-based digital marketing agency that helps the game developer and the game publisher market and launch their games with branding, performance, and dialogue-based campaigns. And we've been working over the last few years with both IP games from our partners as well as non-IP games. So we've seen what are the advantages that a famous brand or IP can give to those marketing campaigns. But interestingly enough as well, for the first 10 years of my career, I actually worked in television and created and produced for television, entertainment and game show formats. So I have a lot of experience about the licensing of IP to many different verticals. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Anatoly Ropotov from Game Insight. I'm the CEO of the company. We do games such as The Tribes, which is our biggest franchise with over 50 million players. We mostly focus on Simulation Tycoon, Hidden Object, and now expanding into more hardcore games like strategy games. We built few titles based on IPs, working with either regional TV stations, and recently we have released a game based on Disney property called Moana, which is our partnership with Disney working on that. So I will be sharing a few perspectives from my previous experience working on also Xbox AAA games, working with Paramount Pictures and a few other IPs there.
Thank you guys for introducing yourself. First I would start with you because you guys recently launched a game based on a Disney IP. And what was the reason why you guys decided to do this IP? So,
we actually have a pretty long history of working with Disney. Around 3-4 years ago, we've licensed some content from Disney for digital distribution, like animated comics and some kind of like visual novels based on some great Disney IP such as DuckTales and some of the Pixar properties for digital distribution. And throughout that partnership that we have nurtured for many years, we had a chance to look into upcoming IPs from Disney, and then we were just waiting for a moment when it kind of clicks. Here we have been showing a couple of game engines or technologies or products in development for quite a while, like doing yearly updates, and Disney was proposing some things like, this is an upcoming IP, we couldn't tell you what it is, but it's going to be really exciting, do we want to match that? At some point, I think it was like more than a year ago, maybe 40 months ago, we saw a perfect fit of a game technology, game engine, and a franchise. And that was kind of like, we could do it much faster, don't spend like 16 months. And just within like 10 months, we built a game based on Moana, which is the top Disney cartoon released last year. It's a great IP. So I think it was a moment of opportunity when all the things have aligned really well. Here is a great game concept, game engine, and a great brand that all of them will benefit each other. So I think it takes a lot of patience to get to that point, because we are working on multiple other IPs and brands. And even in pre-production stage, you could just discover that few things don't fit, or it's going to take much more work, or the expectations of the brand or limitations of the brand will impact production of the title. So I think it's a discussion worth to have. There are some IPs and IP holders that are really easy to work with, and there are some great IPs like Disney IPs that are really restrictive but are really rewarding at the same time, and you have to rewire the brain of the whole development team so they will think just like that brand, to really believe in that idea and live within those kind of restrictions and within the framework of the IP, and try to push the boundaries of that as well. So did anyone else kind of went through that experience with any of the brands?
We have recently announced that we're going to be releasing a game called Snoopy Pop. We licensed the Peanuts IP, and that's coming out in the next couple of probably 3 weeks or 4 weeks. I think, to your point, when you work with particular IP holders, you really have to respect their IP. The Peanuts Worldwide is another one of these IPs that's very closely protected, and it's up to the developers to really convince the IP holder that you're able to truly represent their IP and that you're going to nurture it very much like we would nurture our own IP. So to kind of bridge the conversation, when we go to an IP holder, we're able to show some of our own IP, like Cookie Jam and Panda Pop, which are our two very successful in-house developed IP, and we show them that over 2 years that we've had this IP out there, we continue to foster it, we continue to develop new levels for it, and we show them how we're able to keep the users engaged, and to prove that not only will we treat your IP well, but look at how well we can treat our own IP. And it usually gives the IP holder a level of confidence to be able to work with a company like Jam City. And I do agree with you that we do have separate teams that work on a particular game, and that team has to get to know the brand very well and make sure that it's putting into production the ideas and thoughts of the IP holder.
Okay. Yeah, I think that working with Snoopy is even harder because it's such a respected legacy. It has such a huge follower base over the years. So just like I think with Futurama, for example, you really have to figure out how to address all those issues without frustrating players, without kind of betraying the brand power and things like that. So acting and working on a new IP like Moana, we didn't know how this will turn out, what kind of restrictions we will have. So one of the huge selling points of Moana brand is this heritage of the brand which comes from the Pacific Ocean region. And we had to respect the traditions and legends of people who lived there over 2,000 years ago. So that alone has put certain restrictions for us, like we couldn't have certain types of items or even celebrations. But as you know, like IPs, let's say like Ice Age, as they get sequels, as they evolve, as they keep getting sequels, after maybe 10 years, they start to cover those types of events, and maybe a sequel will be set in a different part of the universe, so you have so much more to work with. So in that sense, working with Moana for us felt somewhat restrictive, and we had to find the ways how to push boundaries of something that hasn't been released yet, while at the same time it has kind of heritage of a brand like Snoopy or Futurama that has followed ways.
That would mean that your flexibility is not there anymore, right? So how do you, what do you think about that?
You have to rethink the flexibility and really have creative approach towards that, and you have to talk with creators of the movie and IP, pitch a couple of ideas, talk with their producers, find the ways around that, and maybe find some analog to that event, or something that will be well known from that era that might have happened, and kind of try to push that boundary just a little bit further. Like, could you let us have, let's say, bananas while they didn't exist there? So things like that. It's at first it's frustrating, but then you find it rewarding. Like, you start to explore this Polynesian culture that you had no idea had so many small features in it, and when you put that authenticity into the game, it really feels like it's its own very unique universe. So it's both blessing and a curse. That's right.
I actually think it's not about losing flexibility. What we've actually discovered also, like during our Futurama production, obviously there's an onboarding process where our team had to learn what are the brand values, what is that universe, what was the original idea of the story writers, what kind of story did they want to tell, how does that all work. But then what we've actually seen is during the production and also during like creating assets for the brand, as soon as we understood what they wanted to do, it was much easier to build this universe ourselves as well, and going into that direction and staying within the brand boundaries that you have, but then building more and more assets that were extremely consistent. So suddenly everything totally made sense, from UA creative to screenshot to app icon to in-game experience was just very well connected because it was the same universe. And I also understand brand holders that they built up this universe, and when I think about, we have a game, Pearl's Pearl, it's set in the 1920s. We also work with like external companies on that, and it's set in the 1920s. And then if you go to an outsource and say, like, for this in object theme, place items, and they come back and place a helicopter in there, our teams go mad as well. It's like, it's 1920s, there were no helicopters. Why would you do this? And I understand from that point of view. Even on our original IPs, we add restrictions to make it consistent, to make it an experience that also players enjoy and really think like, oh, I'm here in the 1920s and it feels like this and it looks like it, and it's very consistent. And I think actually like the IP holder, they understood that this universe is extremely important. And sometimes maybe we on the game development side are a little bit behind, and we slap other things into the games because it's just easier instead of like identifying and understanding the brand value. I mean, it's a learning process, and we went through that as well, and we put things into the game that got rejected maybe in the first pass. But then as soon as you understand what they are trying to do and where they were coming from, it actually not necessarily limited flexibility, but it actually helped us to build a better experience for the users.
Okay. Rob, you were saying that you guys went to the IP holders and that you're showing your own IPs, that you're successful with it, you're producing content, and it's valuable and makes sense to work with you guys together. So does it mean that first you're getting the IP and creating then the game, or you are first having the game and creating then and buying then and licensing then an IP for the game which you have then?
As with everything, I always answer with both. Just because it's truly, we have a very broad range of how we approach it. I can say that in one of our examples, we have a game called Book of Life, Sugar Smash, which Fox came to us and asked us if we could build a game for them. In that case, we already had the game mechanics developed and built out for another internal IP, and we were able to come to market in, I want to say, somewhere under 12 months, which was a record for us, 9 to 12 months, I believe, with very, very good art. And it has been very, very successful. So in that case, we had something ready to go, and we were able to help, we helped each other with what we thought was a really good partnership. On the other hand, there have been definitely some times when we have been moved by an IP that we really want to work with, and while we may not have everything developed ahead of time, when we go and speak with the license holder, we explain to them first our vision and kind of how we feel about it, and explain how we interpret it, and then have more, we would say, creative discussions. And we find in many cases the IP holder doesn't really care so much about the game mechanics at the beginning, rather than making sure that we understand what the brand is and how we're going to display that out to the public, or how the user's going to interact. I think the game mechanics are important, and you have to have a good game, but that's sometimes, I believe, secondary.
Okay. Yes, I'm...
No, just to follow on from that, I think brand owners and IP holders will really value a game developer coming to them and saying, listen, I really want to transform your brand and show the games world what life can exist outside of maybe the TV show or comic or film that you're doing. An interesting story from Oscar Clarke, who licensed the Rocky Horror IP, is that he was a massive believer and a passionate and avid Rocky Horror Show fan, and I think that he was certain that that was one of the reasons why he was able to convince the IP owners that he would represent their game truly and honestly, and I think that's something as game developers that you have to appreciate. If you just look at an IP as a way of just another kind of money churning exercise, I think your chances of success are not as great as if you can actually show that IP owner that you really care for how you're going to express their cherished IP in games.
Was it for Futurama?
For Futurama, it was actually a mix of both,
Okay.
To be very honest. So what we had was around about probably like 2.5 years ago, we had a game in soft launch. It was called Hex 4. So it was a matching game on a hexagon grid where you match 4 tiles instead of 3. And we had this game, and we've seen what we've seen is like significantly higher lifetime value compared to our other puzzle games. But at the same time, extremely high CPIs. So we haven't had the chance to market that game because it was a little bit more complicated, was a little bit more skewing towards male audience, and we haven't been really able to bring this into a state to make it a profitable global launch. So we had this on the one hand side. On the other side, I mean, I obviously have ongoing discussions with license holders looking at their portfolio and IPs, and we've been also talking to Fox about ideas and brainstorming. And at some point, I was just saying, what about Futurama? And can we make a Futurama game? But then the team also looked at their game that they had and the mechanics and Futurama and said, well, if you just do a pure reskin, that's probably not going to work. So how can we go back to a drawing table? And something like you said, how can we make a brand experience? And we did a couple of tests, what the fans actually would value most, and most of them said, bring back the show. So one of our big focus was actually, how can we make this Futurama game a way to actually go beyond the show and explain a completely new story. And this is how it all developed into a very story-driven matching game eventually, where you have a lot of storytelling in the game. We've been working with the original story writers from Futurama on that game, trying to actually explain a universe outside of what has ever been on air to deliver what the fans wanted most. And that was more content around the show, more depth around characters, exploring new planets. So, and that's how all this developed, and we actually ended up in having a game which was really rich on the 3D world, exploring new planets. You take the ship, and when you fly from level to level, you see things and places you haven't seen in the show before, but then having this new layer on storytelling on top. And so it was a combination of both. We had a mini engine ready. We had this ongoing discussion and said okay, let's step back and let's build this brand experience.
Cool. David, you guys...
I actually want to ask a question to all the people that work with high-profile IP, like especially Disney. So acquiring the IP is a lot of hard work, discussing with the license holder, convincing them to work with you. Having an IP is also expensive because you have to, you have to pay licensing fees and maybe revenue share and whatnot. Is it worth it for you?
So at Game Insight we have around 10 simulation tycoon games and in active operation at all times with maybe 6 major revenue drivers for us out of that list. And it's always a question whether we want to launch yet another sim tycoon game and what kind of distinguishing factor, what kind of reason would we have to pursue to make it happen. So for us, expanding the reach of our simulation tycoon game portfolio that has both transportation-focused simulation tycoon games, like about airports, ships, and transportation empire, to more casual things like the tribes and few IPs. We have been looking to expand the reach of simulation tycoon games for us and try to leverage our existing audience and bring it to a bigger brand IP and see what happens. Same applies to kind of perception of players of the new game. We'll see how they will react to some of our properties out there. So for us, it was being good at what we are, building great simulation tycoon games and expanding the audience reach. So yeah, I would agree that there are some steps that you would have to take to do that. But if you just think about production of a new game in general, if you would like to create your own new IP, what you have to invest in it, like here is a pre-production stage with all of your art directors and art producers that have to work maybe for half a year envisioning the whole galaxy out there or a whole world out there. And then you have to produce all of the beautiful 3D assets for ads and things like that. So actually, I think at some point it evens out. It's kind of, it gives you huge advantage of, and leverage of existing assets and existing universe. And it might even shorten the development time of the game. And talking about the development time, I think that developing a game for 12 months, if it's a deeper game, it's still not enough because soft launch period and balancing and improvement just for launch, that's very restrictive. Like good games take time to make, so most of the times you need like at least 18 months and then soft launch to build something big, unless you already have either a game engine or a game idea that really fits well and you know that you could leverage that. So just thinking about the future, the big question to ask yourself if you want to build a game based on IP, do you believe that the market will still be there for a game in 18 or 24 months if it takes so long to sign the deal, start producing that, fully launch, go in soft launch period? So what's going to happen in 24 months from perception of the game genre, perception of the audience, who's going to dominate this market out there? So that's a big question to have. So for a game that was in development less than 12 months, you're pretty sure that you're still going to use this window of opportunity and still be there with a relevant game genre, and relevant brand. But if it's something of a bigger production, then you might have some, you might have to think twice about that.
Okay, then back. You want to
quickly? I think developers, one angle, I think marketing without a doubt is, I would have thought one of the most interesting aspects to talk about, is it worth it? So, on average, you'll pay between 15 and 30% back to the IP holder, plus or minus a minimum guarantee. Very, very simple. It's a maths equation. Instead of spending the equivalent money on marketing, your own homegrown IP is what you have to pay back to the IP holder, going to match it out. And I think that's a complicated question. Anthony Green, who was at TinyCo were the guys that built out the Family Guy.
We own them now, yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, he was claiming between 10 and 20 million installs. He valued the IP at that. I don't know whether that's true or not, give or take. So when you're talking about those kind of numbers, then you could say, well then, yes, of course it's been worth it. But I would have thought that is one of the most interesting discussion points is, does that IP reduce your amount that you have to spend on marketing your game?
I think just to add to that, additive to that analysis is also how the deal is structured with regards to UA. That's the important part. I think the percentage is something that you negotiate, and I think the minimum guarantee is something you negotiate. And the other factor, the third factor, or another axis or three-dimensional thing is to say, well, what are we doing with the user acquisition? Because like you were saying, as far as timing of the IP, we generally are a little bit more careful about doing IP based on a feature, a motion picture, like Moana, for example. Moana is a great one because it's Pixar. You have a lot more guaranteed success just because of the, not guaranteed success, but you have a higher likelihood of success because of Pixar. But making a game based on a feature film is, I believe, to be a risky proposition only because movies sometimes don't do that well. Pixar, generally, you have a much higher chance of success. But if you look at IP that's maybe more evergreen, and the other extreme would be something like Peanuts, which has been around forever, then you also de-risk a little bit, and it does buy you more time. There's no big Peanuts event that we were hoping to match when we made the game, and we now, planning-wise, do look to 2019. What am I going to develop for 2019 so that I do have enough time? And the license holders nowadays are much more patient. They are giving us 18 months to put a game together, and they're not forcing us to put games out quickly because they do understand that a good quality game takes time to make and to test. So that is a good development from, let's say, even 2 years ago with the big license holders.
Yeah, just from my previous experience of building games for Xbox Live Arcade back in the days, I think it was 2007, we signed up with Paramount Pictures to build a game based on The Warriors, one of the classic 1980s movies about New York. And the anniversary they wanted to hit was a specific Blu-ray release DVD date. But this was such an ambitious 4-player versus co-op, online, PvP, things like that, drop in, drop out, beat 'em up game. Like the game shipped, I think, 2 months before it was ready. But they had to hit that date, and obviously back then it was really hard to do over-the-air updates, so just release an update and polish things. So for them it was that decision, like, we don't want to hold that, but the right decision was, let's invest two more months and achieve like much higher Metascore, critic score, and things like that versus just shipping that. So I think the patience between just shipping the game and hitting the time and getting few extra, let's say, 1 million installs or something like that during the launch time frame, or even 5. If your game is not ready for that, if you don't have good enough retention and engagement of players, or if the monetization still isn't there, it might be not worth to put those loyal fans, millions of them, through that experience, and they will join the game anyway at a later point of time. And speaking of the evergreen IPs, that's a really good example out there. So you could just think about something that really fits your audience from a back catalog and has so much legacy, especially if you're targeting much more adult audience. Like most of our hidden object games or simulation tycoon games are being played by 40-plus-year-olds. Like hidden object game is like 50 plus. I don't know, from Wooga's experience, you've got a game for much broader audience. Like we also have one of those with Mirrors of Albion. But when you look at the back catalog, you could find something that really fits your demographics. If it's 20 years old, you know that adults are really comfortable with that. It was something that they grew up with. Maybe it's an evergreen or timeless brand. So this actually gives you advantage to know what kind of audience the IP is going to resonate with.
Another question when it comes to the IPs itself, like we have evergreens like Marvel IPs, Star Wars. Would you guys go for such an IP? Because it's obvious you won't get an exclusive IP. Would you go for it, or would you say exclusive only? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. What do you think about this?
I think, if I may say something, I think there's very few IPs that are really, really, really strong, And I think aside from, let's say, Star Wars and Marvel, I don't think there is anything in that league. So if we could make, let's say, a Star Wars game on mobile, I think I would probably want to do it because it's just so strong. But there are also a lot of examples out there that did not succeed. So I think looking at the power of the IP is one thing, at the global power, because we're in a global market, and if it's not a global IP, then I think it also loses a lot of value. The other thing I would look at is, as Simon was saying, with how can this help you with your user acquisition and your visibility and you're like getting people into your game. And so obviously Star Wars, everybody's going to check out the Star Wars game. But you can also look at IP like as people. So if you look at Glue and how they work with all these famous celebrities and how these guys would then keep promoting that game because they were, of course, benefiting from that. I think that did a lot for them. So suddenly you have a spokesperson that constantly keeps pushing your game and you can have this sort of agreement with them. I think that's very valuable. If you have a sports IP that will also work together, like I don't know, baseball, basketball, football license holder that will work with you and like allow you to incorporate your game into their social media activities and their regular activities. That's very strong because it keeps giving back, it keeps giving you users. If you just have an IP that is like, yeah, here, we're very strong, we have, I don't know, something, space robots from Mars, but we're not going to do more than that. We're just going to give you the IP. Then I think it's not so valuable anymore.
But I mean, if there are like 3, 4, 5 companies having the same IP as you, and you are doing like, let's say you're doing influencer marketing or you're TV marketing, and people are going to the store and searching for Star Wars, they are seeing like 4 or 5 different Star Wars games. What's the benefit for you then?
I think that's difficult, but I think it's also the job of the IP holder to guard his own brand and to not have too many different games out there, because that does dilute the market. And then after the 5th or 6th game, why would you even pick up the 7th? And so I think there are IPs out there where I personally feel like there are way too many games. So I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I'm a big fan of Games Workshop, but there's so many Warhammer games out there. And there's maybe 3 or 4 that are really good. And a lot of the rest is like very niche or just very like doesn't even have anything to do with the brand anymore. Like Warhammer is this game about people fighting and killing each other, and suddenly you have these really simple lane strategy games, like stuff that is totally far away from the brand, just because they give all these different categories, and I wouldn't do that at all.
I'd just like to add that last year, when I spoke on a similar topic, I agree with you that the days of the license holders being able to take one IP and segmenting it into 15 different categories, I think the trend is going away from that. I believe that we as game developers are starting to test different mechanics from different genres, and it gets harder and harder to keep within your lane as you're developing games. And so if I were to negotiate a license today for an IP, I would ask for and bargain pretty hard for as broad an exclusivity as I can get, because those delineations are becoming more artificial. Yeah. And so I agree with you on that.
I think you've hit the point there. I think the marketplace can become so crowded when people are just searching for a game that, yeah, when there's multiple versions of the same IP, I think it can harm both the game developer and the IP owner. And I think IP owners are beginning to realize that more and more and work with the game development community as genuine partners. So you don't necessarily have the days when maybe 5 years ago you had a licensing manager at the IP owner who was just literally looking at hitting their quarterly sales targets and looking at the most strenuous and hard contracts that they were negotiating without looking at how the game can help nurture the IP and extend its lifetime value, etc. But I also think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that IP can be very valuable not when you're just talking about these big triple name IPs. I think there's a lot of good examples of where there's a huge amount of IP out there, especially some legacy IP from a long time ago, that can really help you do a really great job at making a great game. It's not maybe that expensive. It's not maybe, I just take Oscar again with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but there's many other discussions I've had with game developers where some underutilized IP can really be valuable because it resonates with a certain target audience. It may not be global, and it may not be, but it also depends on how big your company is and what kind of size of game you're looking to build and how much revenue you're looking at generating every month. But don't forget that there's the word IP doesn't have to be just Star Wars and Star Trek and Peanuts as well.
And also, like talking about IP, it's not all about like fully branded experiences, right? And I just want to add like one question to the round. I mean, you've seen Plarium with Megan Fox teaming up on Pure UA, on a Pure UA deal, right? Not really integrating her into the game. I believe Panda Pop had also a integration of Scooby-Doo. So it wasn't like a fully branded game, right? It was more like an...
It was a special event. We did it with Scooby-Doo and with the Flintstones.
Do you think that we will see this more often, like in games that are already out there, like an event with an IP and then it disappears again?
So we were inspired by the folks at TinyCo, who once we acquired them, we looked at the Family Guy game Quest for Stuff, which was at the time last year almost 2 years old, and they were really heavily bringing in different IP for different events. They even did one with DC Comics where they had a whole DC world inside Family Guy. Now, Family Guy, the IP lends itself to bringing in pop culture, funny things. You know, they had very many interesting folks in there. Our own IP games like Panda Pop, Cookie Jam, they don't naturally, you can't just one day have, I don't know, the Smurfs show up in Cookie Jam. It doesn't make sense. So one would say, well, then why'd you do Scooby-Doo or the Flintstones? We actually did some testing and we asked our folks, what characters do you like? You know, what do you think is interesting? And the reason we did it was to create excitement around the game. We also want Google and Apple to think our game is still interesting after 2 years. And so therefore it's almost a symbiotic relationship. We bring some excitement to the platform. So Google and Apple are excited to kind of feature what we did. And the integration was done with a lot of planning. We don't just take Scooby-Doo and he doesn't just show up. We actually had special events and levels and costumes, the Flintstones costume for the panda. So we do very integrated things. It was about a month long, so it wasn't just 2-3 days. And our partner, Warner Brothers, was very happy with it. I'd say that we probably aren't going to do it at the same cadence like the Family Guy folks, but we think once or twice a year in each of our own private IPs, it makes sense, it's fun, the audience likes it, and we actually, to some extent, let them help us decide what they want to see. And I think that's a good way to ensure that your return is good.
Yeah, if you look at the way Japanese developers do crossovers in their games, like Puzzle and Dragons in their early years had perhaps up to 2 crossovers per month. They were bringing in real-life brands, anime brands, TV series brands, doing so many crossovers, even with things like food inside the game. And it's so much easier when you do that just in a single region like Japan and you just utilize the big brands. But one of the actual issues of doing that across the whole world is selective territory restrictions for different brands, and some of the brands might not be recognized as well worldwide. So I think that using strong brands inside the game for like few months, we see that trend. Like, let's say Jetpack Joyride recently had Back to the Future tie-in for the anniversary, and things like that happen only if they could work on a big scale. So we're thinking about a few of those for our IPs to do a couple of crossovers. The same way as we do that between our games, having guest characters visiting each other, having major guest stars doing that would be a real cool thing for players to have.
We've done a crossover like that in our game Dungeon Link. Which is a very nice puzzle strategy game with more of a cartoony fantasy RPG vibe. And then we had the Adventure Time characters being sucked into the game, dumped into the tavern, and then there was a whole storyline in the game for these guys to follow. And that worked very well for us in the US, as you said. IPs like that are not always globally super recognized. So in Europe, for example, Adventure Time just isn't that famous. I don't see many people nodding their head when I say Adventure Time. So it's a Cartoon Network IP. It's pretty cool. It's pretty niche. It's a lot of fun. We were very happy to do it, but it's hard to make this kind of thing meaningful on a global scale. Having said that, we're working on another crossover in Adventure Time that's going to be a little bit more globally appealing, I hope.
Simon, I mean, you guys are doing performance marketing and marketing in general, and do you see a big difference when it comes to lower the CPI costs if it's an IP-based game or non-IP-based game?
It depends on the territory, and it depends on how global the IP is, without a doubt. Take Asterix and Friends. And if you looked at, so we were running some campaigns with that game, and certainly within France and Germany, and to a certain extent the UK, marketing that game there was much easier. Not necessarily because the cost of acquisition was so much lower per registration or install, but the CTR was double. Literally, I mean, the CTR for IP-based games, when you resonate with a certain audience, it will reduce the cost of acquisition because you may not have to spend as much as an absolute spend to get the same amount of installs. IP, in my experience of the campaigns we run, hasn't necessarily meant that the CPA or CPI that you have to spend reduces, but the CTR is as much as double a typical non-IP campaign. So that's where the benefit kicks in.
So you say 50%?
In terms of, if you're looking to get, say, 10,000 installs, yes. The absolute money you would have to spend to acquire them tends to be a lot less because the CTR becomes more effective.
So it's worth it, because
I would
if you
say
only
yes.
pay 30% licensing fee, then you win.
Yeah.
I mean, Sebastian, when you think back, because you said like the CPI costs were so high, and that was one of the reasons why you guys said, okay, let's look for an IP. Now, after 1 year, 1.5 years after the launch, would you do it again?
That's a really good question. I mean, if we look into the game performance overall, I mean, it's very obvious. It's not a Candy Crush. Otherwise, you would see it in the top grossing charts. So it's more in the middle. It's doing okay, but it's also not huge. But the main reason, and that's something that we were aware when we signed the deal and had the discussions, is like Futurama is extremely male and very young, and it's very different to typical puzzle games. And we knew this from the beginning and tried to bridge that gap between audience and gameplay through the storyline, like I said, like the branded experience. And what we've actually seen is when we reach the audience that likes the type of game and the brand, we have these really high click rates, extremely high LTVs in the game as well, super profitable cohorts that we are getting in. However, that overlap is actually much smaller than we thought. So the overlap between like brand fans and gameplay fans, there's an overlap, and we can reach them and target them, obviously, through the targeting mechanisms and see like really good CPIs, but like the volume that we get from this overlap is slightly too small. And then we see like whenever we go more into the branded category, maybe people drop out because they don't like the gameplay. And if we go more into the gameplay focused marketing strategies, then we see like people are like, what is like this robot doing here and why is it so rude kind of feedback, right? And that's something that we kindly underestimated. We thought that this overlap would be bigger, but that was a learning experience. And I think, I mean, right now, usually we are not actively looking for licenses, so it must be a natural match between gameplay, game team, the product lead. But if we see like something really unique coming up and someone has a brilliant idea, we would probably do it again.
We've had a similar experience with taking Airport City to some of the regions in Asia. We worked with a great partner, Six Waves, that brought us. We work with them for over 7 years now, and they brought us a couple of TV series and music and movie IPs to kind of fuse the game with, so we changed the title screen, the characters, we brought in a special storyline to a special kind of regional release of the game. And it did both good and bad things. Obviously, we managed to reach a very loyal airport TV series focused audience that wants to travel, wants to do things. So this was the audience that we wanted to reach. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it will expand the audience. So in that case, you kind of get a certain part of that. So in the end, just a wider reach of Airport City brand itself did better in the end than the limited edition. So we operate just like kind of more global edition that didn't limit that. But still, it managed to reach a very new specific audience for us. So I think that moves some type of the deals closer to those Scooby-Doo tie-ins. Like if you have a great game, sometimes the brand might just restrict its reach versus just expand its reach. You have to think careful about that. But I would say that doesn't only happen to brands, it also happens just to your own games. Like we built a game with turn-based strategy, sci-fi. Obviously, TBS itself is a very small niche and sci-fi is even lesser niche. And you could escape that by applying a bigger brand on top of that. That's one of those kind of antithesis in that case. Like you could expand that by applying something really big on top of that. So that's something that we're working in that direction right now. And yeah, that adds actually to your point, like, do you want to build another Star Wars or Marvel game? If there is a game mechanic that is heavily, I would say, underutilized because it severely restricts the audience, if you put a great brand on top of that, you will manage to reach much broader audience. So that's one of the cases where this actually works. I've seen a couple of, let's say, tops Star Wars collectible card game. As a standalone collectible card game, I don't think it would have done that well, but as a Star Wars game, it performs great. And yeah, well, some of brands just hold this restrictive value, some of them expand the reach. You need to figure out in advance why you're doing that.
Okay, we are coming to an end, unfortunately. We can go on like for hours. Seems very interesting topics. We have a lot of experiences here, but 10 minutes left, so maybe we will have the Q&A now. If you guys have any questions, please ask.
Yeah, thanks guys. Very interesting panel. Quick question about licensing and IP. And I mean, to sign a deal is very nice, but the more elements actually a brand has, for example, like characters, and now we talk about voiceovers and audio. And speaking about Wooga and Futurama, you had this awesome storylines in the game, but they, if I remember right, they were mute. Like, I mean, there was no one speaking at that time, or no Fry was telling anything. So how difficult and significant it is actually for you guys and anyone else to get the audio files, for example?
I mean, for Futurama, that was actually a difficult one. We actually do have a tiny bit of during gameplay, we have voiceovers and the characters would talk, but for the comics, for the new story, there's no voiceover. Reason for that, Hollywood world, tons of contracts between all the different parties involved. And Futurama is actually very heavy on like having professional voiceovers. So Katie Segal is talking for Leela. It's Billy West, I believe, and like a couple of others, really high-profile people that we've been actually talking to, trying to get them on board as well. But it was just a matter of like timing, budgeting costs. Do we want to include them? We're close to have like the first chapters with voiceover, but then also decided, okay, how much does that add now? Also knowing that most people, like we've seen that in our games, like 70% of our players play without sound anyway. And of the remaining, lots of them actually listen to Spotify and prefer that sound is automatically muted. Lots of tickets that we get, like when we don't automatically mute sound whenever there's background music. So that's why we actually said, like, okay, the incremental value of having the voiceovers versus like the cost for these high-profile actors, voice actors, wasn't like making us a profitable case. That was just a case-by-case decision.
Any other questions?
My question is, what do you know about the free IPs I mean, IPs that were created 50 years ago. For example, I don't know, some books of Charles Dickens, like The Three Musketeers, and that are supposed to be free. And maybe for indie developers, I was talking yesterday with them, it could be a way. And should we have to have some fear about using this kind of IPs?
I'm gonna take that one because I actually am the general counsel for our company. So if you were to come to me and say, hey, I'd like to make a game with some free IP, it becomes like everything else in the legal world that's not black and white. You really have to look to see the art, I think, is the first thing that people look at. For example, if you think of Aladdin, that's kind of been out there, and the genies, and that's kind of been out there for a long time. But if you make the genie blue and he's funny and he starts talking like Robin Williams, well, then you're going to have some problems. I think it really depends on, if you're going to use free IP, how creative is your team to get the feel for something and create something new with it. And I think obviously literature and old fairy tales, believe me, everyone's been borrowing those fairy tales and making it their own, and it's usually done by the character development. And that's how we identify Snow White or whatever it is or Sleeping Beauty, whatever it is, with one particular IP holder, when in reality it was public domain at some point.
I just think it's a little bit left of center, the comments I want to make, but it goes on the same lines. Invest in getting the right legal advice if you're going to do anything relating to IP. I'll give you one very good example. Again, unfortunately, going back to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but it's very exemplary. So Oscar did a deal with the original rights holders of the theatre play, the musical. And he wanted to then utilize the very famous lips from the film poster as part of his imagery. He couldn't. And the reason why is because the film that was made based on the musical and the rights underpinning the film were completely separate and owned by the film rights owners, not by the original theatre play owners. So when and if you do a deal with an IP owner, be so damn careful about exactly what you're able to use and what you're not.
Lord of the Rings, movie license, book license, a lot of different games. Movie license games did well, book license games all failed. Because they didn't look like the movies.
So is there a room for improvisation or R&D in your space? Like if there is a brand that is not in games historically, but wants to be in games, and they approach you guys and they say, well, let's just work together. We will help you with marketing, we will help you with everything you need, we just don't know this market yet. Like NASCAR or National Geographic, one of these iconic brands, but not necessarily in the gaming space. Would you work with them?
Yeah, I think I'll take that. We had a couple of those approaches out there, but when you get in that deal and you start talking about multi-specialization teams within those companies, like will you do co-marketing, let's say as NASCAR on your racing track, will you be able to do it on TV and that, they have to figure out tens of things to align that, and a lot of organizations are not necessarily structured or prepared for that to undertake the whole brand transformation into they couldn't transform that fully into a game. Like you could only utilize maybe 20% power of that brand, and that's it. So we went through some of those, and we ended up not signing up. When we found out that we couldn't do this and that, let's say we come to a point to discuss co-marketing. Like, could we actually co-market it at the same time and split the revenue accordingly? And then the legal team comes in, and then the finance team comes in, and they want to do some kind of special separate audit of marketing spend, and they never did it before. So they say it's going to take 6 months to create those procedures and do things like that. So in a lot of cases, if it's a very well-known brand and they didn't do them themselves, there is a reason for that. It's just too hard for them to restructure the rights and start aligning all these procedures. But maybe there are some brands that are much more flexible with that. But I think that utilizing the the full brand power just requires too many things aligned at the proper moment.
Thank you guys for being on the panel and sharing all your knowledge. And yeah, thank you.